President Putin recently announced a partial mobilization of 300,000 troops to fight in Ukraine. Many analysts, however, point out that there are so many problems within the Russian military that this partial mobilization may not change the outcome of the war. Even Chinese military experts highlight that Russia's military reforms in recent years, far from being successful, have had a negative impact on some of Putin's mobilization ideas. Let's have a discussion to explore the details. Before I go further, please subscribe to my channel. My channel is still in its infancy. I really need your support, thank you. Russia began to reform its military almost immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Before and after Putin became president, the Russian military faced two major problems. One was that the government could not afford large-scale military forces, and the other was that the Russian military was not suited for small, high-tech regional wars. In response, Russia has undertaken a number of military reforms, including those led by Putin himself. The main measures included massive reduction of troops, the disbanding of most of the units stationed in foreign countries, the abolition of theater commands, and a large number of air and naval combat platforms, even the reduction of strategic forces, such as the rocket force. Among those measures, the one that most impacted the plan of partial mobilization during the Ukraine war was that Putin and military leaders decided to keep many army units with a small number of personnel, with the plan to expand them to wartime strength through mobilization orders if war broke out. That decision left many units with simply not enough soldiers and officers and far less fighting power when the war broke out in Ukraine. In fact, those who study Russian military reform have long known about these shortcomings, including the top brass. After 2010, the Russian military reduced its 6 military districts to 4 in an attempt to be more effective in fighting regional wars on the scale of those in Ukraine, with fewer troops overall. The idea is to keep only a standing joint operation force with reasonably high technology, increasing the number of soldiers only when needed. But on the ground in Ukraine, that decision proved a failure. The Russian military has even reduced the level of command from 4 to 3. The 3 levels are Joint Strategic Command, Campaign Command and Brigade. The conversion from division-level units to synthetic brigades is to aim at establishing joint forces targeting an operational theater in the shortest possible time. In theory, the newly formed 3-level command system can carry out highly flexible and highly mobile combat operations. The idea is actually similar to reforms already undertaken by China and the United States, but Russia has a fatal weakness in implementing it. The logistics of the Russian military simply cannot support it, a weakness proved by the war in Ukraine. As a result of the various reform decisions mentioned above, the Russian synthetic brigades were undermanned and low-tech, so the advantages of the flexibility and mobility existed only on paper. In the initial stages of its assault on Ukraine, for example, the Russian military tried to use elite units created during the reforms to strike directly at Kiev, the Ukrainian capital. But the Ukrainians, backed by Western intelligence, have twice defeated attacks on Kiev by Russian paratroopers and armor groups. That forced Putin back into a long war of attrition in eastern Ukraine. That was seen as a symbol of Russia's failure to reform its military. To make matters worse, Russia's 10th military reform, around the time Putin came to power, destroyed the Soviet-era wartime mobilization system and changed the troop formation structure, training, material and technical support to both compulsory and contract military service. Amid all these negative factors, the synthetic brigades of Russia's military entered the seesaw phase of the war in Ukraine. They quickly have shown being too weak and not supplied properly. The tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and even trucks of the brigades are severely insufficient and cannot be effectively replenished. Soon the ancient T-62 tanks and civilian trucks were sent to the front line, indicating that the Russian army not only lost many tanks but also had no reliable means of replenishing them. In the end, it had to use very old tanks and civilian trucks, reducing the capacity of the Russian army on the front line. As mentioned before, the reform's destruction of the Soviet mobilization system, Putin's reluctance to formally declare war on Ukraine, and limited mobilization until September due to the need to calm the people, left the Russian army without effective personnel replenishment for 6 months and many positions without enough soldiers to guard. That is one of the main reasons for Ukraine's recent success in counterstrike and taking back large areas of land. Compared with the Russian army, the Air Force and Navy seem to have failed even more. After years of reform, the number of Russian fighters and warships has fallen sharply. One of the reasons the Russian cruiser Moskva was sunk was because there were too few escorts, too little air cover. There are too few advanced weapons, such as cruise missiles, for the military to deploy. So far, the Russian Air Force has yet to defeat the Ukrainian air defense, which is less than a fraction of the mighty Russian military, and things are getting even worse. Due to the lack of smart weapons such as guided bombs, the Russian aircraft is forced to attack Ukrainian targets at close range and is frequently shot down. This shows that Russia has failed to achieve the goal of building a standing force with a certain level of technology and has stagnated in terms of informatization and intelligence. This problem is impossible to solve by partial mobilization orders. In short, after a series of failures that left the Russian army stranded with neither high technology nor enough personnel, Putin ordered a partial mobilization, in effect out of necessity. His goal has also become to win full control of 4 eastern Ukrainian states. Arguably, Russian forces are now restricted to close combat and direct engagement and no longer pose a direct threat to much of Ukraine. Of course, Russia's war capacity is still far more than the Ukraine, although Putin were forced to old-fashioned ground combat for a long time, but through the partial mobilization, a growing number of Russian soldiers would move into the battlefield in eastern Ukraine. Russia may eventually control the 4 states completely and forced peace talks on the west and Ukraine in order to legitimize its control of the 4 states. However, we can see that Russia's military reform has actually failed. Even if Putin implements partial mobilization, it will not change the reality that the Russian military is not of high technical level and has to pay a heavy price to achieve limited results. Thank you for watching, and again, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you.